Hockey Inside Out, brought to you by Videotron.
Welcome to another episode of Hockey Inside Out. We're absolutely thrilled to have Dick Irvin with us today, a recent recipient of the Order of Canada. What was your reaction to that, Dick?
Total shock. It was like a stone-cold phone call from a nice lady at the Governor General's office in Ottawa, and I had no idea why I was getting this phone call. And turns out this whole thing had been in the works through a lot of wonderful friends of mine for over 2 years. But I said to her, "Have you got the right number?" And, and then she finally said, "Oh yes." She finally said to me, "Are you going to accept it?" I guess I was kind of stunned, not saying anything. I said, "Oh yes, I'll accept it." So it's been very nice.
Very well deserved. I think one of the first stories you ever wrote, Dick, Dave, as a journalist, was about Dick.
Absolutely. 1976, I visited Dick Irvin's home, and I can still see the headline. Dick Irvin is a very busy man, and you know what? That headline would still stand up today because you guys have a very funny way of dealing with retirement. I mean, there's no such thing. It's you retire from one job and you just sort of nicely morph into something else. Well, what people should understand about Dick's Order of Canada, of course, is that not only is it for his broadcasting work that goes back decades, but it's also for the charity work that he has done. And the very first autograph, Dick, that I ever got as a kid was of Gordie Howe, and it was signed not on one of these fancy hockey cards today that kids collect, but it was signed on the back of a check that my father took to one of your sports celebrity dinners, and Gordie signed the back of a Royal Bank of Canada. Probably wasn't even a check, it was a check register, I think. My dad wouldn't fork over the check, but Gordie signed the back of that, and so we have a history that goes back longer than you even know.
Now, you sort of grew up at the Forum, Dick. What's your earliest memory of the Forum and the Canadians?
Well, my dad was coaching Toronto through till 1940, and he came to Montreal in 41 after the Canadians had won the grand total of 10 games the year before. Check it out, it's the worst year in the team's history. And but he commuted. Our home was in Regina, and he would leave Regina and come down, coach his hockey team, and go back home. But you see, in those days, it was a 48-game season.
That's right.
And he would leave home out west in, 1st of October, second week in October. Mm-hmm. The season would start. The first game that he coached the Montreal Canadiens was the 4th of November in 1940. So that shows you when, And then he'd be home by the end of March. Mm-hmm. So he could, anyway, 48 games became 50, became 60, became 70. So 11 years after he came here, we moved. But we would come down at Christmas. He lived in the Mount Royal Hotel, just up the street here, and that was my first time. He took the streetcar to work to the Forum at practice. Never had his car down here in the winter, and I came down at that Christmas, and I walked into the Forum dressing room, and it was really funny. The night they closed the Forum, it was only a couple of days after that. I thought to myself, the first time I walked into the Forum, Elmer Locke and Kenny Reardon were in the dressing room, and there I was at the closing of the Forum. 56 years later, right. And Elmer Locke and Kenny Reardon were in the dressing room, and I was there. It really got to me.
One of the great stories Dick won't tell about himself necessarily is in 1955, the very famous Richard riot. You may remember there was a movie that was done a number of years ago called Maurice Richard with Roy Dupuis as the lead, playing the Rocket. Stephen McCaddy plays Dick's father. And I remember Dick and I were talking about Dick going to see the movie for the first time. In fact, you saw it at the Montreal Forum, which is now a movie theater. It's a movie complex. And Dick remembers going there with a little bit of trepidation, wondering how his dad was going to be played because, Dick Irvin was seen by the way this movie was done, it was a good guys and bad guys, the white hats on the Francophones and the black hats on the Anglos. But there was the thought that Dick had, I think, that your dad was going to be portrayed as a little bit of a villain. And I remember when we spoke about this, the night of the Richard riot, you were upstairs keeping stats for your dad in the press box of the Forum when all hell broke loose. When the tear gas canister goes off, the cops rush down. They tell your dad, you guys have forfeited the game, clear the building. And in the movie, Stephen McCaddy playing your dad is going crazy, bouncing off the walls. And you say in reality that, in fact, you'd never seen your dad calmer. And he said, Dick, I want to see what's going on. Let's get in the car and go for a drive around town. So it was then that you knew this was not a documentary, but rather going to be a little bit of creative license taken.
Well, you're right. And people had called me. A couple of people had called me, who had seen the movie before I did, said, "Oh, you're not going to like what they do about your dad. Oh, don't let your sister see it." And this kind of stuff. And so I did. You're right. I just really wondered what it was going to. But when that happened, because it was so totally different than the way things were, I burst out laughing. And I turned to the person with me, and I started to explain why I was laughing, and a guy that was sitting there, about 14 people in the theater, and the guy was sitting down, he came back to me and told me to be quiet because I was making too much noise.
Shut up, what do you know? That's right.
Yeah, and, so yeah, it was, but you know, Stephen McCaddy, boy, it was a lesson to be learned there. You know, he called me about 2 times before they even started making the movie. You want to know, did my dad chew gum? Did he wear a hat? Did he do this? He wanted to, you know, he was a professional, and he played the part, and he won an award for that, you know.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
It's a terrific movie.
What's your favorite memory of your dad's days coaching the Canadians when you look back?
Well, I think the only time I ever saw one of his teams win the Stanley Cup, 1953, when Elmer Locke scored the cup-winning goal in overtime on Sugar Jim Henry, and that was quite a moment to be part of, you know, because he'd won. That was his 4th cup, but I had not been present at the previous 3. Well, one of them I was 1 month old, so I guess I wasn't at the game there out in Calgary. But yeah, I got a good sense that night of, I was 21 years old, but of when somebody puts their life into something like the hockey team, like winning the Stanley Cup, to see the reaction and what it meant to him, it was quite
amazing. Stanley Cup win too. That was the one that Elmer Locke finally had his nose broken for the 7th and last time. Elmer's only
after
coach.
The season was over.
That's right. Yeah, Elmer's only coach in his entire National Hockey League career was your dad, and Elmer is now one of our best friends. I mean, we spend a lot of time. We've been out for lunch together, and we sort of hang with him the best we can right now. So it's amazing to see how these links, how friendships can endure as much as they do.
Now, a lot of people might not know, Dick, you played at McGill. You were a
right.
Redmond. Describe yourself as a hockey player.
2 years. I was the 4th-line center in a 3-line team. And, yeah, I played the University of Saskatchewan for 2 years, and then when the family moved here and I transferred to McGill, I played for the Redmond for 2 years. But, you know, there were like 3 other teams in the league. U of M, they don't have hockey anymore. Laval, they don't have hockey anymore. And the University of Toronto. And heck, out in Saskatchewan, we didn't even have a league to play in, and we just sort of played exhibition games all year. Boy, college hockey's really changed, hasn't it?
Dick, who reminds you most of yourself on today's Montreal Canadiens?
Whoever's on the bench all night.
Okay then. George Parros?
No, not quite.
With that, we'll be back after a short break, and Dick will tell us a story about the night Canadiens fans threatened to burn down the Forum if his father was coaching the game. Welcome back to Hockey Inside Out. It's impossible to have Dick Irvin on the show without asking him about Danny Gallivan. What made that relationship so special, Dick?
Well, you know, when people, as you young fellows will know when you finally retire, people say to you, what was the highlight of your career, you know? And I have 2 personal highlights. One is that I was the English MC the night they closed the Forum. In 1996, it was such a marvelous ceremony. It still sends chills up my spine to think of it. And the other was 17 years in the broadcast booth beside Danny Gallivan. Yeah. I mean, the young broadcasters would kill to do 17 games with Danny Gallivan, and I did 17 years. I knew Danny. I knew him through my dad. When I was the official scorer at the Forum, I used to sit right beside the broadcast booth. Like, there was the booth and there was me sitting there doing the official. So I could hear everything Danny said. I was very comfortable in the area. So when it came time to move in to work with him, it was like, well, here I am again, you know. And Danny taught me a great lesson. When he treated me like an equal from day one. And I was the raw kid, you know, just off, and it clicked. We never rehearsed. People used to do our trivia stuff. People used to think, oh, they rehearse that. Never. Danny hated meetings. I know broadcasters would get together for 1-2 hours before each game to go over the lineup and what. Danny wouldn't go over. In the days when I used to go downstairs and upstairs, I'd be downstairs to finish the show as the host. Danny would be halfway to Nuns Island by the time I got off the air, and we wouldn't see each other or talk again until the next game. And I walk up 2 minutes into the first period. There's Danny broadcasting, and I just sit down beside him, and away we go.
2 things I loved about Danny. One would be that today, a lot of today's broadcasters go down to the dressing room, they hang out with the players, or they're doing the research. Danny, maybe 2 or 3 times in his career?
32 years.
Yeah, went down into the Canadiens' dressing room.
Yeah,
no point in being down there.
One, somebody had some tickets for him, for buddies of his from the Maritime. The other, he wanted to congratulate one of his favorite players, maybe Henry, maybe Jean Bell, I don't know, on some milestone they had reached that night. Yeah. That was the only 2 times he divorced himself completely from
the second was the technology. When the change came in technology, and Danny was no longer required to use the handheld microphone once they had the headset with the microphone attached to it. Danny would wear that, but he still would lean over that broadcast booth with a disconnected microphone, just so he could hang over the booth and have something in his hand, so he could be doing the play-by-play, and that stands out for me.
Well, another person you work with, Howie Meeker. I was lucky enough as a kid to go to his hockey school a couple of times. Okay. What was he like?
Well, I was the first one to interview Howie Meeker. You know, he was working for the CBC in Newfoundland. And he was in town for some convention or something, and there was a game that night, on a Wednesday night, the old Wednesday, and Red Fisher was supposed to be the analyst. And somebody said to Ralph Mellenby, the producer, Howie Meeker's in town. He was a sportscaster, and so he's on the air. How about using him on the game? So they called Red, and Red said, okay, I'll work Saturday night, as long as I can work on one night this week. So Red got his money for working Saturday and not Wednesday. So anyway, Howie's there with us, and we used to do the between periods analyst up in the broadcast booth. They had a camera like up on a shelf there. So the game, first period comes and goes, and I'm sitting there. I'm the guy doing the interview. First one to interview Howie Meeker. So, well, Howie, comments on the first period, you know. Well, he took off. He took off, and I mean, I wasn't ready for it. Canada wasn't ready for it. He was Howie right from the beginning. And he changed. Without Howie Meeker, there's no Don Cherry. I'll tell you that right now. How he changed we were such wimps, and you can't do that. See what he did. That was wrong. That guy, J.C. Trombley, should never have done that. You know, Tim Horton made a mistake. Look at that. Look at what he's doing there. We're sitting there. We never said talk like that.
So Howie would have to change a little bit of what he does today, because in today's uncensored internet world, the golly gee wouldn't fly.
Too many crickets.
He'd have to use it. Yeah, he'd need the profanities. But that wasn't Howie. Howie was, and he was great. He was a compelling guy to watch. You would sit and just come away educated, and his enthusiasm, his energy was completely contagious.
I know. He was great. Loved hockey. Loved hockey.
You mentioned Don Cherry. Your take on Don Cherry?
I was the first to interview Don, too, when he became a member of the Hockey Night crew. It wasn't Coach's Corner, but he'd been coaching in Colorado. That last year he coached the famous Colorado Rockies, I think they were called, right. The first one. And they didn't make the playoffs, so Hockey Night hired Don for the balance of the playoffs, just to be an in-studio analyst. And the first game he worked was, and I was doing the hosting of the show, was in Calgary, in a series between Calgary and Philadelphia. Don shows up, and that was his first time on hockey. He doesn't remember that, but I do. And as they say, the rest is history.
And I have a lot of time, a lot of respect for Don Cherry for what he has done for the game, and just, again, the energy. And it's amazing when you sit. If you're actually at an arena and you are watching a hockey game from the press box, the first intermission comes, I swear, the number of media people who will sort of stampede out to the television sets to watch Don Cherry. It's amazing. I don't always agree with him at all. I took issue with his shredding Brandon Pruss this past week for the incident that he got into with Ben Bishop. But you know what? I mean, grapes is grapes. I mean, he will say whatever's on his mind. When I did a piece on the Coach's Corner a number of years ago, you'd sit and watch him prepare for this. He has a few notes scrawled down on a piece of paper. He would take 2 giant-sized cups of black coffee, bolt them down just before he goes on the air, goes out, and he's literally a sweaty, destroyed mess by the time he gets off the set 5 minutes later, because he's just literally left. When they say just leave it all on the ice, Grapes leaves it all on the set for sure.
Now, Bob Cole. Your thoughts on Bob Cole?
Well, Bob and I worked, he started out in radio. Like, he did the 72 series in radio, I think. I think it was. Yeah. And so Bob eased his way into Hockey Night, I enjoyed working with Bob. He's a very good friend of mine. And the thing about Bob, and I have to laugh when I watch him now, and it's the first game of the season, or it's October the 27th or something like that, and if you close your eyes, you think he's broadcasting the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Final. He's never lost that enthusiasm, and I don't know what's going to happen now with all this business that's going on with the inner workings of the television industry for hockey in this country now, what's going to change, but they'll have to drag Bob kicking and screaming. I mean, he's going to keep going as long as he can.
And
more power to him. Yeah. And he loves the game. It still comes through, and I love listening to him.
You're right, though, about the first game to the last game, Dick, because the voice, I mean, is quite remarkable. I mean, he can call a play as they're winding up behind the net, and by the time they get down to the other end, I mean, his voice has just come up like this, and he's very, very exciting to listen to.
Yeah. Well, that's it for this segment of the show. Having Dick Irvin for only 2 segments just isn't enough, so we'll be back with an extended version of the show this week. Welcome back to Hockey Inside Out. Canadiens fans this year have been chanting at times to fire Michel Therrien. There was a night when Dick Irvin's dad, the fans threatened to burn down the Forum if he showed up to coach the game. The Canadiens players that night decided to put on their fire hats before the game. Can you tell us a bit about that story, Dick?
Not quite, but briefly, the Canadiens in the 40s, they went from being the worst to the best. And when they were the best team, they won 4 straight first-place finishes. They won 2 Stanley Cups. The Rocket was the Rocket. Elmer was Elmer. Bill Durnan was the greatest goalie in the world. I mean, things were great. Sure. Then in 47-48, the wheels all came off. Early in the season, Toe Blake, who was their leader, the captain and team leader, broke his leg and retired. I think he retired and he was lying on the ice. He told he'd never play again. And the Rocket somehow had a bad year, couldn't find the net. Elmer won the scoring, but they dropped down. And of course, this didn't go over well with the Forum faithful, as they used to call them. Team was on the road. They played in Chicago on a Sunday night and they lost, and they were back to play in Toronto on Wednesday. In that period of time, somebody called up the Forum, and a newspaper called the Petit Journal, and they said, if Irvin's behind the bench in the next home game, which was the following Saturday night, we're going to burn down the Forum. Now, you see, you people today that want to fire the coach, you know how to do it. You know, you do the Twitter and the
You don't
texting,
use a newspaper as a middleman. Yeah, that's what you text it, you tweet it. Exactly,
that's all nothing.
Yeah.
These guys were serious. So the players in Toronto decided they were behind the coach. They liked the guy. They went to some hat shop and got the guy to make them about 20 of these flimsy kind of but Stetson-looking hats, bright red. They skated on the ice in Toronto on the Wednesday night. They took their hockey sticks and they were like putting out a fire, you know, like firemen. Anyway, I don't know if they won that game or not, or the next one, but Irvin was behind the bench on Saturday night and nobody burned down the
And
Forum.
sadly, the media relations crew would get to a team today and say, you know what, that's not going to play well, and they would sort of have the whole thing dumbed down, and there would be no comments, and everyone would be coached to say the same thing, and God, that'd be boring.
No, that's the way it was.
Now, you saw so many great hockey players over the years. Like, who was your favorite Canadian to watch?
Well, you know, I kind of go by eras. If you're going to go way back, when I first came around as a little guy and my dad was the coach, Elmer Locke was my favorite. Yeah. And in the middle part of following the team, I'd say Jean Beliveau. And in the latter part of, say, the late 80s, 90s, when it was Mats Naslund. And those are the three players that you know, if you're talking about favorite players.
Yeah.
You know. But I cop out when people ask me who's the best player you ever saw, because I've seen them all from starting back in the 30s, you know. So I always say I don't have a best player, but the Rocket is the most exciting player I ever saw. Guy Lafleur is the most exciting player I ever broadcast. But if I was to pick one guy who I thought for a period of time raised the individual level of the game up to the highest I've ever seen it, it would be Mario Lemieux when the 2 years that Pittsburgh won the Cup in 91 and 91, 92. I
just take a game by the scruff of his neck and just shake him, right?
Check his stat. He had something like 85 points in those two playoff years or somewhere around there. And I've never seen a guy play, and I was lucky because, well, I was lucky. The Canadians were kind of eliminated, or maybe we didn't make the playoffs, I forget. So they assigned me to do a lot of Pittsburgh games, hockey night. So I was able to see that, and that's, I'll never forget that.
And it's impossible to compare eras too, right? I mean, you just cannot do that because the game has changed so much. The equipment has changed, the speed of it. You know what? You look at some of those old classic games on the NHL Network today, and you see guys out there taking 2-minute shifts. I love the virgin ice and the white boards, and everything just looks beautiful, right? I mean, I know I still live a little in the past, but to see some of those old games are fabulous. But that said, I mean, you look at some of those guys, as great as they were within the context of that game, those guys trying to play hockey today would be absolutely killed.
You know, my dad came here not that long after Howie Morenz died, a couple of years. So then along came Maurice Richard. So there was always the memory of Morenz was still fresh enough that people started to compare, you know. Yeah, right. And my dad's answer to that was always, a good player today would have been a good player yesterday, and the good player yesterday would be a good player today.
That's right.
It was always what, and I firmly believe that today. I find, like, I saw a game the other night on TV, Ottawa and Pittsburgh. It was a terrific hockey game. That Canadians game with Chicago here a couple of weeks ago. It was a good, but there are too many teams, and there are too many bad teams, and too many times I don't hang until the end of the game.
Brutal hockey.
That's what I feel, and there's just too many teams, and there'll never be another. Like you take the Canadiens dynasty; they had Lafleur, but how many other guys from that team made the Hockey Hall of Fame? Yeah. How many guys in Gretzky's Oilers made the Hall of Fame? How many guys on Brian Trotier's Islanders made the Hall of Fame?
That's right. Yeah.
But now, can you see a team winning the Stanley Cup today and saying 7 of those players are going to be in the Hockey Hall of Fame in another 10 or 20 years? I don't think so. And it's no fault of the players.
Especially not the salary cap.
I've got nothing wrong
and with free
the players.
agency, Dick, you're not going to see those teams. What that 56 to 60 had a dozen guys at least were on all 5 of those teams.
Scotty had 14.
Yeah. So I mean, you're not going to see that anymore with free agency and with trades and with the salary cap and so on. Just the whole roster, just the entire structure of the game has changed so dramatically that you'll never see a dynasty in the sense that you're going to have the same guys coming back year after year after year on the same club.
Now, in your broadcasting career, Dick, is there one moment that stands out as your most special moment?
Yeah, funny there is, in a way. The one I keep going back to is the year of 1971. the year that the Canadiens beat the Bruins, first of all, who had finished 24 points ahead of them in the regular season. They weren't supposed to do that. And then they beat Minnesota in a very good series. And then they beat Chicago. 7th game, the home team wins except the 7th game, and Montreal wins in Chicago. Beliveau's last game, his last act, carrying the cup off the ice, which was so fitting. But you know, Red Fisher and I argue about this all. He calls that year a fluke. There are more players from that Montreal team in '71 in the Hockey Hall of Fame than the Bruins had. So, you know, you're talking John Beliveau, Frank Mahovlich, Yvan Cournoyer. You're not talking chopped liver here, you know.
No, that's right.
They had a heck of a hockey team, and they won. And you know, the circumstances were typical Canadians. Nothing was normal. I mean, Al McNeil was the coach. Henry Richard got in a fight with Al McNeil. Here's a good line for you guys. You know, all the analyzing that goes on today, and the panel discussions and all. And the guys do a great job. I don't know how they find stuff to talk about. I really don't. Once upon a time, somebody said to Henry Richard, a media type, very officially, now, what system do the Montreal Canadiens use to get the puck out of their own end? And Henry's answer was, we get it out as fast as we can.
And that's all you need to know about that, right?
So today there's 5 minutes of explanations and replays.
X's, O's, graphs, charts, oh yeah.
Well, Mr. Irvin, we can't thank you enough for coming on the HIO show. I'm sure our fans will enjoy watching it. Our scheduled guests next week are Chris Nyland and Jack Todd, and we'll be taking questions from fans on the HIO site about the first part of the season for the Canadiens. We'll see you then.